Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. This is Cristi Habermann, the host of Grieving Insomniac. This is your first time here listening to my podcast. Welcome. I am a grieving mother of a 25-year-old son that died of cancer in 2011. At the time that my son died, there was not the available grief resources that there are now. And I knew as part of my healing journey is that I needed to do some education for the non-grievers about what it's really like to be a grieving mom. I couldn't find any information when my son first died. In fact, people wouldn't even talk to me about the fact that my son died. It was one of the most difficult parts of my grieving was the fact that my family disappeared, my friends disappeared, and there was no one to talk to me about the fact that my son died, which is how we got to the topic of our podcast today, which is called The Gaslighting of Grief. Now, there might be some strong reactions to the fact that I'm calling it gaslighting, but essentially what I'm referring to is the fact that gaslighting is denying someone else's reality. And if you stop to think about it, there are a lot of people that deny the reality of how badly grief can impact you. I tell people it changed who I am. It changed everything about me. It changed how I react to the world. It changed how I viewed the world. The world became a place that was dangerous and hurtful, and I was afraid. And then people say hurtful things. Some people said it was my fault he died. Some people would say, because I didn't raise him right. Some people would say, well, don't be sad. You got 25 years with him. Like, don't be sad. If you're one of those people that are saying those kind of things to people about their grief, you're gaslighting them. The official definition, for those of you that don't know, I am a licensed mental health counselor and a licensed substance abuse counselor because I can't help but bring my education into this conversation, even though this is not coming from a professional perspective. It is coming from an individual, I lost my child perspective. So the official definition of gaslighting is it's a psychological manipulation technique that causes someone to question their own reality, memories, and thoughts. And the goal is to make the victim dependent on the gaslighter for emotional support and validation. At the time that my son died, I definitely was depending on my support system to validate me and support me in my grief journey. That didn't happen. People would say to me, why are you so sad? Don't you think it's time for you to get over that? He's in a better place now. I didn't feel like he was in a better place now, but everyone else did. But did they really? Or were they just saying that? We're being gaslit. That's what that is. So they talk about being gaslit in a relationship. So the difference between, you hear it commonly referred to narcissists, gaslight people, predators gaslight people, criminals gaslight people. I'm talking about ordinary people. Whether they're in relationship with you as a spouse, as a relative, brother and sister, friends. I'm talking about ordinary people. And I think they gaslight because they don't understand grief. And I'm sorry about that you don't understand grief. But yet I'm not. I don't want you to understand my grief. Because if you understand my grief, that means that you have lost a child. And I don't want that for anybody. I don't want that for my worst enemy. And I'm not asking you to understand my grief. Because there's only one way. And that's losing a child. What I'm asking you to do is don't deny my reality. My reality was I couldn't get out of bed. But I wasn't sleeping. I couldn't work. I couldn't think. Nothing else mattered except for this pain that I was feeling inside of me. And that's what scared people. So I think people gaslight because it scares them to see your pain. They gaslight you because they can't cope with your pain. And most people are self-centered. They don't want to take the time to understand you and your pain. And I was so mad when somebody told me that I needed to focus on the positives, the 25 years that I had them. There is a time for that. Don't get me wrong. There is a time for that. But I get to determine when that time is, not what you tell me. And I think that's the hardest part for people to understand. You can't get there today. And I can't get there because you tell me I have to get there. Each person has to go through their individual process in order to get there. And then that's how they gaslight us. Well, you shouldn't be so sad. Really? How do you know? How do you know that I should not be so sad? There are people out there that will deny that you should be that sad. Do you want to know what that looks like for grief? What that looks like for grief is, I understand how you feel my dog died. I understand how you feel because my grandparents died. Or my parents died. I understand how you feel. I don't know, did you get your heart ripped out? When our children die, part of us dies too. Because our child shared our bodies. They shared our blood. They share our DNA. They literally died. So part of us dies when our children die. So when you say that it's the same as when your dog died, I doubt it. Because what I feel, you can't measure. So when you deny my experience by saying that, you're gaslighting me. So that's one example. They don't understand or they refuse to listen. Those people are the ones that you reach out and you say, I'm really struggling today. And then they say to you, so am I. My boss just really yelled at me today. And then they go on and on and on and on. And they never talk to you about your grief. So over the years, I have learned not to talk about my grief with anyone. I drove to work this week and I listened to the song Simple Man by Leonard Skinner, talking about my son. And I just had this overwhelming sadness. But when I get to work, I smile and I don't say anything to anybody that I'm really sad today. Because I listened to this really sad song and it brought up memories of my son. And in the last 6 months, for those of you that don't know, I got cancer. And the cancer's gone now. I've gone through all of my treatments. But through this cancer journey, I've learned that I'm going to start talking about my son. And I talk about having cancer. And if it makes you uncomfortable, that's really your problem. It's not mine. So people are becoming more used to it. They're more used to me saying that I miss my son. But they're not totally comfortable with it either. Trivializing. So trivializing goes along with the denial. So when you tell me that losing your pet was the same as losing my child, you're trivializing my grief. You're not listening to how badly it is. You're comparing it to how you feel instead of putting yourself in my shoes and trying to understand what it's like to have your whole world disintegrate. And I'm telling you, my whole world disintegrated. I go into it in episode 1, 91 episodes ago, about how I blacked out when I found out that my son died. I blacked out. I heard my heart ripping and I was crawling on the floor screaming. Totally out of my control. It scared me so badly that it took me years to talk about that experience where I was walking and talking but blacked out. And I'm not a drinker. Like, I know people operate that way that drink a lot, and I was in my teen years, but wow, it was a scary sensation. So I struggle when you trivialize my grief. Might have that experience when their parents die or their siblings die or those kind of things. But don't compare it to mine, because that's where we go wrong. Is if you really want to listen to someone and you really want to understand their grief, you need to pay attention. You need to pay attention to what they're saying, what they talk about. Because have you ever felt your heart rip in half and hear it rip in half? I heard it. I felt it. And I maintain I felt him die. Didn't know it at the time, but I felt the moment he left the earth. When you say that it's the same as your dog dying, you're trivializing. Absolutely. And then there's projection. So projection is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And you can do that in a good way and you can do that in a bad way. So projecting looks like someone saying to you, you should be happy there with God now. Really? So they're putting how they feel onto you, their expectations, their belief system. The biggest piece is their belief system. Because if people got to know me, they would know that I don't have the same belief system. But it was important to them. So they projected that onto me. And I would just stay silent because I prefer to keep my own beliefs to myself. But it didn't make me like you very much when you did that. Because you weren't hearing me. And I was very concerned about where Christopher was going to go after he died. I was very concerned about the afterlife. I was very concerned about those things. And people could not have those conversations with me. I did a lot of that exploration on my own, and no one would engage in conversation with me about it. I eventually found a community, but my immediate relatives and my immediate friends just weren't there. And it's honestly heartbreaking because they're missing out. So I find great comfort from the fact that I get signs from Christopher that certain music makes me think of him and I get these warm, fuzzy feelings. I have occasionally seen him. I see him in dreams. Those things bring me comfort. So when someone says you're going to hell for those things, you're projecting onto me your beliefs. Or that he went to heaven, you're projecting onto me your beliefs. And that means you're not listening to me. Twisting the facts. I don't know if this happens to everyone, but this definitely happened to me. The night Christopher died, one of his friends went to a great effort to create a fake Facebook profile, post on my counseling business page that I was an awful mother, and that Christopher had told him or her that I was an awful mother, and that how dare I be a counselor because I was an awful mother. And one of my greatest fears when it came to Christopher dying was that I'd been a bad mother. So they twisted the facts. Was I the perfect mom? No, I wasn't. Did I deserve to have my child die? No, I didn't. And did I deserve to have them do that? No, I didn't. I know that they were hurting, but lashing out at me, that's twisting the facts. That's twisting what he said. And it took a lot of work. And I don't know if this happens to other people. I don't see people talk about this very much. I know it does because I have talked to other grieving parents that have struggled with this a little bit. But when people manipulate their own feelings and the facts to meet their own ends. It's very disturbing. And so they went out of their way to tell me that I was a bad mother. And I had to hold on to my truth. My truth was, my son loved me. I was a single parent with Christopher for the first 7 years of his life. We had a tight bond and we were very close. And as all adults do, he moved on into the world as he was supposed to. And that did not make me a bad mother because he moved on to the world as he was supposed to. And they had all kinds of comments and all kinds of things to say about the fact that we lived apart and in different areas. And they actually felt like they owned him more than I owned him. I don't know how else to put it that way. They wanted him buried where he lived. They wanted the funeral to be about them. And they were calling me and saying, hey, he needs to be buried here so we can see him. You don't want him buried where his family is? Where his brother, his parents, everyone else is? You don't want him buried there? That makes no sense to me. Why would he be buried? It made no sense. It still makes no sense. And they went as far as having a pastor call me from the Simple Church. Simple Church of Bossier City. Yes, I'm calling you out. And I will never forgive you for this. This is twisting facts, projection, trivializing, all of it. This guy calls me and says that Christopher was a part of the Simple Church in Bossier. He went to their church services. He was involved in their church. He had a lot of friends that were involved in his church. And he really felt like that it was important that Christopher be buried in Bossier City. I hadn't joined a church here in South Dakota. It's not been something that I've engaged in throughout my adult life. I was having a hard time finding a pastor to bury Christopher. And this guy is going on and on about how well he knows Christopher and how he knows what Christopher wanted and that he knows that Christopher would want to be buried in Louisiana and not with his family. And that the funeral should be there, and it was just a whole thing. So I said to this guy, it sounds like Christopher was really important to you. And right now I don't have anybody that's willing to perform the ceremony for me. So would you come to South Dakota? If Christopher's so important to you, would you come to South Dakota and perform the ceremony for his funeral? And the guy goes, well, no. I gotta work. I'm only a part-time pastor. Why would I come to South Dakota and bury him? And I said to that man, I said, well, then Christopher's not that important to you. If you can't come to South Dakota and bury him, why would I bury him in Louisiana if he's not that important to you? That was trivializing my grief. That was trivializing his family. That was denial of our grief. Like, he totally gaslit me and expected me to cave to the pressure of the church to have him buried in Louisiana. And I don't know which friend put him up to it, but someone from his friend group put him up to it. I was just like, no, my son's going to be buried in South Dakota, where his family is, where we can visit his grave. He's not going to be buried in Louisiana, where his friends are. And if you have that experience, I'm very sorry about that. So stereotyping. Because I live separately from my son and miles away, and they didn't think I visited him enough. They felt like we were unimportant. And i.e., I was a bad mother, so he should be buried in Louisiana, not South Dakota. More gaslighting. Much more gaslighting. So isolating. Once those people found out that Christopher was not going to be buried in Louisiana, never talked to me again. Nothing. Which is fine. It's fine. They're Christopher's friends. They're not my friends. But I was nice enough to let them have a funeral in Louisiana so they could say their goodbyes. Or a viewing. I don't know what you call it, a memorial. I let them do that as long as they paid for it. Which again, of course, they got very upset because they thought I should pay for it. It's like, no, I'm not paying for it. This is what you guys want. This is for what you need. But I think the most important thing about this gaslighting of the grief is that in my case, they made me question my sanity. And it was all over that whole whether or not I was a good mother or not. I spent hours and years struggling with that and coming to terms with what I believe to be true. Like, I cannot explain how important it is for someone that is grieving to hold on to what you know is true. And what I knew was true about Christopher dying is, 1, my son loved me. 1, I did not cause my son to die. 3, I have no control over whether or not someone dies or not. I could have been a perfect mother. The mistakes that I thought I made, which I did make mistakes, I did. All parents do. Those are not what caused his death. Cancer caused his death. Actually, it was the medical treatments that caused his death because he died from chemo, not from cancer. Big distinction. But it's the medical treatments that caused his death. Hang on to that. Hang on to what you know is true in your situation. So why do people gaslight grievers? Why do they do it? They want to deny the grief. In our society, we have what I call a toxic positivity problem. In American culture especially. There is this assumption that you'll have 3 days. 3 days to bury, to make the arrangements, bury, to take off. And after those 3 days, you'll be back to work. And it's not going to affect you. Oh, you can't cry at work. No. The countless number of people that tell you it's not as bad as you think it is. Well, I don't understand why you hurt that much. It was only your son. He lived 25 years. You need to focus on the positive 25 years. I didn't know that those 25 years were going to be the best years of my life. I didn't know. Well, he's with God now, and that's the best place for him. Yeah, no. The best place for my son is here on earth living a life. That's the best place for my son. So people tell you things to A, stop their hurting, 2, to match their belief systems, and 3, the denial of your pain. It's painful to see other people in pain. That's why so many people say, I want to be a counselor. They get in that room with that person and they see the pain and then they go, I'm out. That happens at my job all the time. People are like, I can be a counselor. I want to be a counselor. I can help them kids as well as you can. So sure, the first few times the kids talking about surface stuff, they get into the hard stuff that breaks your heart, and you have to be present for that other person. They're like, I'm out. You got to talk to their counselor about that. Except for it makes the other person feel abandoned. The hard part is sitting with someone with grief and going into those moments when they're questioning themselves and saying, please explain to me why my son died. Please. And there's no explanation about why your son died. It was his time up. That was it. And you feel so powerless. Absolutely powerless to change it. That's what people need from you, and that's what people don't have the ability to do. They don't have that ability. Until they lose their own children. Immediately, there's this empathic understanding. And you're like, oh my God, my pain. It hurts for you. It's not exactly the same. It is not. And I'm not trying to say that it is. But what I'm saying is that those of us that have lost children have an understanding of this that everyone else does not. And that understanding comes out when we listen, when we watch, when we write. We understand. So how do you cope with the denial of your grief? You educate others. So this is gently explained. I'm not gentle at all. Be grateful you don't understand is what I say. And when I got cancer, everyone's reaction was, oh, you have cancer. And it was hard at first. I'm not going to lie. It's hard at first. But what's hard about it is thinking that I would be the same as Chris and die in 3 weeks. It's not even really getting the cancer. It was the fact that, am I going to die like Chris did in 3 weeks? And clearly I didn't, because here I am months later. I think 4 or 5 months later, I think. Anyway, after the initial shock of it, I realized that the hardest thing I've ever done in my life is Chris dying. Cancer has nothing on Chris dying. And I'd start saying that to people. There are worse things than getting cancer. My son dying was the worst thing that ever happened to me. There are worse things. And I say that to people. I said that to my doctor. Because she was like, do you need to go to counseling? I'm like, for what? She goes, well, you have cancer. This is not as bad as my son dying. It's a walk in the freaking park. Like, I can still go to work. I can still think. I can do all of these things. My son dying made me bedbound for months and years. I thought I was dying for years. Educate your truth. And don't worry about how the other people respond. Just don't. It's their job, and I tell this in counseling all the time. It is their job to manage their emotions. It is not your job to manage their emotions. And as a therapist, I am used to helping other people manage their emotions. So I have to take a step back and not do that. Seek support from understanding individuals. Find your grief community. It has taken me a few years to find my grief community, but I know who they are. And those are the ones that I will talk to about my grief, but I won't talk to anyone else. Set boundaries. I cannot tell you how many times I have cut people out of my life, like they are gone. My cousins are one. My cousins couldn't tolerate my grief, couldn't tolerate the changes in me. Because they'll tell you I was nice before, but really what that means is that I allowed people to walk on me, and I don't anymore. Cut ties with my mom. She was abusive before Christopher died, but afterwards, she wanted me to take care of her emotionally, and I just couldn't. I had to take care of myself. He just acted like I was still expected to be Counselor Cristi to him. Like, I really had to change some boundaries. Change some boundaries with some people. I'm more isolated now. But I'm okay with that, because through this process of coping with my grief, I have learned to stand on my own as my own person. I enjoy my own company. I don't depend on other people. I have best friends that provide me the support I need with grief. There's not too many other people I talk to about it, but over time, it gets better. You get more used to it. You start to learn how to handle when the grief comes, and you just ride the wave. Because that's all you can do. And that's one of my recommendations, is you ride the wave of grief. Just got to. So you do whatever it is that you use for coping. Mine is music. I can look and listen to that sad music, and I can go into my work. I'm still sad when I go into work, but people are so self-absorbed they don't notice. And I got to the point where I can't cry anymore because all my tears are gone. Can I even tell you the last time I cried? My eyes water, but I don't cry. And I just feel like it's because it's all gone. I used it all up. I cried them all out. So there may become a time when you get there too. Find a therapist, especially in the beginning if you're struggling. I did go to EMDR therapy. I highly recommend it, especially if you had a traumatic death. So let me explain what I believe to be traumatic. Okay, so our children are not supposed to die before us. That's a number fundamental belief. Since we have modern medicine, death is not as close to us. So that's one of the things that people struggle with, is that belief system that since child mortality has gone down so low, our children are not supposed to die before us. That belief alone can be traumatic when our children die. So when you have a traumatic experience like that, and I'll just use my own example of my brain shutting off, just poof, going offline. Couldn't think, couldn't talk. It was black, I couldn't see. And the ripping noise, my heart literally, I swear to God, breaking. Still maintain breaking. That moment in time gets frozen, so that you hear the knowledge of your child dying, and that knowledge gets frozen in that moment. No new information can come in until you unfreeze the brain, and that's what EMDR did. So when I unfroze my brain, from that moment, only that moment, then I could start to begin to process my grief in an appropriate way. So if you are a trauma therapist or you are a counselor listening to this podcast, I want to emphasize that, because my therapist did not want to do EMDR on my grief. And I told her I need to do EMDR on the moment I found out my son died. And I could feel my brain. I'm very somatic, so I'm well aware of what's happening in my body. And I could feel my brain unfreezing. I love EMDR for that reason. Feel it unfreezing. And then I can realistically cope with whatever that moment was. So find a therapist. Validate your own feelings. You don't need anybody else to tell you it's as bad as it is. Validate it for yourself. It was bad. It was so bad. Actively listen to yourself. I still struggle with the bad mother thing. There are times when memory comes into my head and I think, God, I was such a bad mother when I did that. I have to actively combat that thought and say, you cannot judge yourself based on the eyes of today. Because I'm looking back at that memory using the knowledge I have today, saying, oh, you're a bad person. Don't do that. Find a mantra that works for you to dispute that thought, that memory, that belief that you have that's an incorrect belief about the way your child died. And go at your own pace. Don't let a spouse, a friend, or anyone else push you into anything you don't want to do. Like someone saying, focus on the first 25 years of his life. They told me that 2 months into grieving. I wasn't ready. I'm not even sure I'm ready now. It's 13 years later. Like, I'm well aware that those first 25 years were pretty great. I don't need you to tell me that the last 13 haven't sucked. And that every holiday and every Christmas, I miss my son terribly. And I still can't work on his birthday, and I still can't work on his death day, and that's just how it is, how it's going to be for the rest of my life. And I've just accepted that. And that's the other thing. First, accept that this is how his life is going to be. And you're going to grieve that previous life. And you need to allow yourself to do that too. And I promise you, if you're early on in grief, I promise you, you will not forget. You will not forget your child. I do struggle with forgetting his voice because it's been so long since I heard it. But I don't forget what he looks like. I don't forget the memories. And I have a poor memory. So I don't want you to forget those things. So I think that's the end of what I have to say about gaslighting grief. And there's a lot of things I had to say I did not realize. It's a very important topic, though. Don't let anyone gaslight your grief. This is Cristi Habermann, host of Grieving Insomniacs, signing off. Have a great day.